Very much. I'm going to go now to Rushanara, who I think has got some questions on the self-employed in particular. Rushanara.
Hi. Morning. Before I go into self-employed, Rain, I just had a follow-up on the point about loans to the chair's question. We've heard reports about the way some banks are behaving, and it sort of echoes the worst actions during the financial crisis and the global restructuring group scandal. How much are you focusing and looking at and keeping an eye on and monitoring what banks are up to, and whether they are behaving appropriately? And do you think there should be enforcement action, much tougher action by the government and by the Bank of England, NFCA and others, to make sure that we don't fall into the same trap as we had 10 years ago and we're still trying to recover from the global restructuring scandal?
So I think the FCA and the CMA should be using their usual powers to follow up, to make sure that best practice is being followed. I think what's most important, that I think is important to see, is just the monitoring of how many loans are coming out. So I think one of the things I think we all need to look at is with those business interruption loan scheme that was designed at speed. It's only been operational for a few days really now, but I think what we want to make sure is that as many businesses are getting loans as possible on terms that are as favorable as possible, given the government guarantees. So I think it's certainly something we're monitoring. We're interested in both where it's working really well, so where businesses are able to access that money at speed from their banks, and where there are issues, where it's been slower for some of those loans to appear. And I think for us, there's two issues that we have an eye on. One is the speed at which smaller businesses can access those business interruption loans, and the terms on which those are being offered. The second area is just really, at the moment, there's no mechanism for those medium-sized businesses, some of which are very large regional employers. They might be supporting 3,000 jobs in the southwest, and those medium-sized businesses don't have a scheme that's open to them at the moment.
Thank you. Kate, did you want to add anything to that?
Not on that question. I don't think Rain's probably best placed to answer it.
Yeah, thank you. Moving on to the self-employed and the income support scheme that the Chancellor announced last week. How does it compare with other countries? And you've touched on some of this already, but who are the main losers? Because we're hearing, obviously, from our constituents, a lot of people who don't fall into, don't qualify. Could perhaps, Kate, do you want to start?
Sure. So schemes to support the self-employed are much newer in other countries. It's Norway that's been talked about most, where again they're providing 80% of earnings. Contacts with our Norwegian unions actually say that scheme is in, Norwegian union colleagues, that scheme is in pretty early stages of development. In other countries, in Belgium, for example, they're paying flat rate payments to the self-employed. I think obviously the self-employed population is complex and it's a much harder scheme to deliver. Our understanding is that around kind of 3.8 million of the 5 million people who are self-employed are going to qualify. And obviously that does leave a significant number of people out. I think, some of the losers are going to be people who started their self-employment this year. That's a tricky situation, but I think, very difficult for the government to address, given that people do need to have some proof of their income and a tax return. I think one of the things we're pushing for is that obviously a lot of self-employed people have been kind of pushed into self-employment by business models which use that as a tax advantage. So self-employment, very, very common across construction, other industries, kind of in the creative industries, often used as a model where people could be employed. And one of the things we really want to see is employers, wherever possible, putting people through their payroll to make sure they can access the main employee scheme, because we think that's going to be the quickest way to get people support.
Sorry. So I just a supplementary on that. I mean, you're talking about medium-term responses, which of course, quite rightly, government and trade unions and opposition parties, we all need to focus on that. But we're in the here and now. I have had lots of emails from constituents, particularly in the creative industries sector. Many of my constituents work in that sector, freelancers, and my colleagues have as well. We're being bombarded with those just over 1.2 million that don't fall into the category that the government has set out. They need a response here and now. They're running out of money very quickly. And we're going to push more people into difficulty. What do you think the government should be doing now to respond to it?
Well, I think there is something about looking at the interim support, and when we look at the support that's through the social security system, I know it's, in many ways inadequate, but I think if our social security system was operating better, if we had removed the 5-week wait from universal credit, perhaps if we were removing the savings rules, which meant people couldn't get access to it, and also if we were looking at the generosity of those payments, I know that's not a perfect solution for those people, but I do think it would be addressing a lot of their concerns.
I beg to differ, because I think it might help some people, but what we've got is people on mortgages. We've got the spectre of, if you are in a 2-person household earning under 50,000, then you qualify. If you're over 50,000, and that seems to be quite ridiculous, frankly. What do you think the government should be doing to redress that obvious problem here?
So, Rushanara, I missed some of your question because your sound cut off. I think you were talking about the hard income cut off at 50,000, right?
Yeah.
So I think obviously it should be on kind of individual income. I do think something the government might look at is kind of how hard that 50,000 cut-off is, and could it be applied more on a taper basis. I think that is the basis on which the employee scheme has been designed, basically, so there's no hard income cut-off. I guess the one kind of difference where we'd like to see the employed scheme look a little bit more like the self-employed scheme is that self-employed people can carry on working and receive the support, and that's like I think both Rain and I were talking about the need for support with short-time working for the employee scheme. So I think there's kind of transfers from both the schemes basically that we need to look at as the next stage.
Rain, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think Kate has sort of covered all of the main points. I think, as she was sort of illustrating, some of the challenges is with the self-employed. It's a diverse group of people, and I think we do want to see the support for the self-employed primarily as with all of these schemes, with those who are most vulnerable, i.e. those who are at risk of losing their jobs, or those who are on lower incomes and are self-employed and have lost their income. Some of the challenges around self-employment is, of course, you might be in a position where you are able to continue to work. So it's a bit like where we've seen the support for sectors that are particularly distressed. We want the support to really be focused on those whose income has really been hit because there are a sector where they're self-employed and they're not able to work, or where their incomes are very low to start with, and therefore are less likely to have savings that they can fall back on.
And can you say a bit about what support is available to startups, and what should be available to them?
Well, for startups, like most small businesses, there's various schemes that can be helpful. So obviously they are eligible for the job retention scheme, and even if you are a single owner director of a company, you can furlough yourself if you have had to shut up operations. As long as you are able to, you can discharge your duties as a director, but you are eligible for that scheme. So if you're a very small startup, there is that. You are obviously also eligible for the short-term business interruption loan schemes. And I think one of the areas that we've been looking at as well is for very small businesses. There's also the grants that are available via the business rates relief scheme. So if you are a small business and you're eligible for small business rates relief, you should be eligible for a 10k grant from local authorities. I think one of the things that will be important to monitor is to make sure that those grants are being dispersed by local authorities and that they are reaching the people in need. And there are some issues around shared workspaces as well, and how some of that rates relief is apportioned in shared workspaces.
Great. I just have a couple of final questions. Do you think that the introduction of the scheme for self-employed, which comes into effect in June, is my understanding, is that acceptable? And what are people meant to do in the meantime? And also, you mentioned local authorities. Local authorities have faced financial cuts for a decade. I know my own local authority is struggling to cope with dealing with the public service dimension of what they're doing, and they don't have the resources. I know it's not directly CBI responsibility, but for both of you, can you just reflect on what government should be doing to support local services, local authorities, because they're at the front line of doing some of this stuff, supporting people in work through these sorts of grants, but also responding to directly to providing frontline services.
So absolutely, I think you're right. Local authorities are already under huge pressure and will be as this crisis evolves. And I think that's why it was very welcome that the Chancellor in the emergency budget set aside more funding for local authorities. I think it's also important that the business rates relief was matched from central government, and that's something that we pushed very hard for. I think you're right. One of the concerns we have is about the capacity of local authorities as well, particularly as the crisis evolves. They will have staff who are obviously, the majority of their staff are working from home already. They will have staff who are ill or self-isolating. So I think making sure that local authorities have the capacity to disperse some of these loans is really important, and certainly something we're monitoring, and also looking for gaps where some local authorities may find it easier to make these funds available and others just may not have the capacity. And I think monitoring where it's working and where it's not will be hugely important.
Have you, Rain, have you got any evidence yet on what's going on? And also just on that second point, the first point about the self-employed and when the new support package.
Sorry, I didn't come back to your first question. I think we don't have any evidence really at the moment because the loans aren't, or the direct grants rather, aren't due to be dispersed until April. So it's really only in April that we'll be able to monitor how well that system is working. I think you're on the issue of the self-employed. The reason, my understanding of part of the reason why it's not available until June was to allow more people to be eligible for the scheme, for all of those who may not have already filled out their self-employed tax returns, which is the basis of which the Treasury are able to assess who is eligible. Now, of course, it's hugely challenging for some of those households not being able to get that income until June. Of course, what we hope would work is they would be able, where possible, to access loans via their banks, and banks should know that that money is coming in June and be able to help employees. We know banks have already allowed people to defer mortgage payments and other things around that, but it obviously will be a more vulnerable time for those households, and I think it's something we just have to keep our eye on.
Kate. Excuse me.
I think in both these cases we're seeing kind of the legacy of basically a decade of cuts, in that HMRC are saying we cannot get the loan scheme up and running any quicker, and that's because we've seen staff cuts in HMRC over the last decade, staff cuts in DWP as well, which means that the DWP systems, which you might think we'd had some thoughts about using the contributory benefit system, for example, as a way to get people money quickly, and those services have just been kind of decimated over the last decade, and that's what they're seeing the legacy of now. Similarly with local authorities, we've had an enormous funding squeeze over the last decade, and exactly as Rain says, they're going to be more vital than ever. We hope they are going to get the support they need, but it sounds, it's a useless thing to say don't start from here, but we really are seeing the impact of those cuts over time right now.